Hi, I'm Kent. Recently I realized I've been working on Shapecast for about a year, so I figured in this video I would do a little bit of retrospective, talk about where I've been, what I've been working on, and where I hope to take it. I've been doing some traveling recently, so I haven't had much time to spend in the Pottery studio, but I realized that I started Shapecast under similar conditions last summer. Before I started working on Shapecast, I realized one of the limitations in my own ceramics practice was in making molds for my slip casting. When I first started ceramics, I knew I wanted to practice a lot. It's way better to go ahead and iterate many times, that way you can learn from each iteration, as opposed to trying to put a lot of effort into any one pot. I saw this firsthand in the ceramics class I was taking at the beginning of the year. There were several students that basically tried really hard on very few pots, and pretty much inevitably at some point during the process something failed. Because every time they were doing something, they were basically doing it for the first time. And as many of you know, ceramics is a little bit unforgiving, so if you get something wrong at one point, basically all the work goes up in flames. Well, maybe not up in flames, but maybe glazed to a kiln shelf or shattered. That part of my learning actually worked really well. With slip casting, it's relatively easy to make a pot, and I could do that over and over again. I learned glazing, I learned how the clay worked, and all those different things. However, I only had a handful of forms, and I realized that I needed to basically apply the same practice to making my molds. Making molds at the time was a relatively high effort task, and I didn't really want to do it. I went ahead and did a deep dive in plaster, and while I was doing that, I went back to my roots of 3D modeling some forms. Doing that was relatively painful, but after doing it a few times, I realized I could probably get some software to do this for me. The transformations I was doing in the CAD software were relatively straightforward, or rather formulaic. Maybe they're a little bit complicated. And that's a great use for software. If you're doing the same thing over and over again, potentially you can write code to automate it. So I did that a few times, and I started working on some software for me. However, one night I was sitting out on the back deck and having a beer, and I was wondering, maybe I could turn this into a web app. So with some help with ChatGPT, I went ahead and threw together a quick web demo and was able to get a rendering of a profile into a 3D pot. That is basically the source of the preview that's used in Shapecast today. So that was very encouraging. It came together relatively quickly, maybe a little deceptively so. But with that in place, I figured it'd be worth the effort to go ahead and turn this into a web app for others to use as well. Last summer, I was doing some traveling as well. I'd actually met a woman at a research conference, and we were dating a little bit, and so I was going back and forth to visit her, and I had some downtime where I could sit down and work on some code. That involved a lot of banging my head against the wall or against the keyboard, trying to get the 2D and 3D processing to work properly. Unfortunately, that relationship fizzled, but the code managed to last. I finally got it to work, but it was a little bit of a house of cards. Under the hood is a little bit ugly, but it was actually producing the models I needed. So I went ahead and wrapped that in a web application, so I added logins and authentication and some databases and some connections to the backend server and launched that for all of you guys to use in the private beta. That was the origins of getting Shapecast off the ground. Next, I basically moved into kind of a steady state. As people started using it, and I was using it more and more, I found some bugs and had to fix those, both on the underlying geometry processing as well as in the web app. These are things I'm capable of doing, but weren't very exciting, so it took a little bit of motivation to actually solve some of them. During that time, I also wanted to add some more features to Shapecast, and I did some experiments. However, I realized that the geometry processing code underneath Shapecast was relatively brittle. I could make a small change, and unfortunately it would break the generation of pots. So going from something that was relatively quick and dirty into something that was much more stable was definitely a challenge, and then taking that code base and extending it was even more problematic. I was able to rewrite some of the core features within Shapecast without breaking anything, and that made the processing a little bit more simple, but there was still a lot of roadblocks there, and that prevented me from adding the features that I wanted to. My background is in research, and I realized there are a couple of research papers here to be had. The first one I worked on was actually started last summer, and I did interviews with several different slipcasters trying to understand their process. Could it be that technology might help them out? And what were the key constraints in developing their pottery and their ceramics process? There weren't really any smoking guns in terms of obvious things to fix. However, there were several constraints that were really interesting. The second paper was on Shapecast itself and a bunch of the early users. I sent out a survey earlier in the year, and several of you answered that, and that wound up being the basis of the paper. It described that early usage as well as the technology itself. I've submitted those papers several times, and they've gotten rejected several times. Unfortunately, that's how research goes sometimes. However, I have drafts of both of them, and I'm hoping to submit them again, and maybe they'll actually get published. The last thing going on around this time was me taking my ceramics classes. I've been doing ceramics for about 3.5 years, and I went ahead and decided to take class to see if there were any big holes in my knowledge. Turns out, no, there really wasn't the case. However, spending the time in the studio was really fun. I've done all of my ceramics until that point basically here in my garage, and I really do miss the community setting. I would like to find some sort of studio to work on, however, my constraints are a little bit challenging. Not many of them do slip casting, and obviously I film these videos as well, and I'm not making pots in a production way, but I really do enjoy that community. So between the bug fixing and the research and the ceramics class, that basically sucked up most of my ceramics time, and I wasn't able to make a whole lot of progress on core features of Shapecast by itself. However, you guys kept using it, and the numbers kept going up in terms of the number of pots being produced, which was cool to see. So that brings us to today and me thinking about Shapecast as an actual product and a business. As I mentioned, my background is in research, and one of the things I wanted to try and understand was how to commercialize research. And Shapecast is basically a test in doing that. I've spent most of my career here in Silicon Valley working for big tech companies, and my job has basically been to go and create new technologies and then to try and get those into the product groups. Unfortunately, product groups are really bad at consuming new technologies. They're really good at doing the same old thing over and over again, but when it comes time to doing something fundamentally new, basically companies build immune systems to prevent that from happening, even though that was my job to go and create those new technologies. So I started to wonder if maybe I should get rid of the big company, and if I did this by myself or within the context of a small company, it might be easier. And so that kind of launched what I've been doing for the past couple of years. I tried another idea completely unrelated to ceramics before Shapecast, and I had a really hard time getting customers. So I put that on the shelf and decided to go ahead and start again. That brings me up to the beginning of Shapecast that I was just talking about last summer. Given the problem with finding customers with my last product, I wanted to go ahead and get early validation, and that slip casting study I mentioned was really an attempt to try and do that. Go ahead and find problems that are within the community already. It didn't do that, as I mentioned. However, I still thought there would be something here. There are definitely several people out there using 3D printing, and CAD is annoying, so I wondered if I just went ahead and built it, if that latent need might arise. So one of the things I did differently and very deliberately was I basically built Shapecast here on my YouTube channel. You saw me iterate and try a bunch of different things and go from not knowing how to really make these molds into something that worked reasonably well. It's not done by any stretch, but it's definitely good enough to go ahead and produce a lot of production molds. So in doing so, you both saw the process of creating it, but also me demonstrating it being used. Around that time, I went ahead and created a waitlist sign up, and several people signed up for that, which was also very encouraging. So once I got that initial code working, I went ahead and launched it, and it's been growing since. So back on the business side, one of the challenges was seeing if Shapecast could be big enough to be meaningful. I really wasn't intending this to be just a hobby. I really wanted it to see if I could grow it into a big business, getting back into this idea of commercializing research. That meant it had to be big enough to be able to sustain itself. I did some math relatively early on with the number of users I had with Shapecast, the growth rate I was having, and what I thought would be a reasonable amount to charge, and the numbers didn't look very promising. It looked like it'd be way too small. And that was a little bit discouraging. However, several months later, I was watching some podcasts around business stuff, and they recommended some books, and I went and read those, and I realized, oh, there might actually be a path here in terms of growing Shapecast. And this really comes down to value, making sure that Shapecast provides something that is of meaningful value, that others want to buy it, and value here is really measured in dollars. If it's something that's relatively easy and straightforward to do, there's not much value. If it's something rare or that can bring you a lot of income in your own ceramics business, that has a lot of value associated with it. So basically, I need to help ceramicists in a meaningful way increase the number of pots they sell, the amount they sell them for, or in some other way grow their business. And in doing so, through Shapecast, hopefully I can capture some of that value. I think what I've been working on with Shapecast does that, although in a limited way. Creating more pots and making the molds more easy, I think, is a value to the business. You can expand your selection of pots, and that lets you sell more of them, or you can iterate on your molds easier and get to make more interesting, better designs a lot easier than you could before. Or for some of you, you can actually just go ahead and create your own custom designs, where before that was too hard to do at all. However, I'm fully aware that revolved forms of one-piece molds are rather limiting. And that gets back to wanting to increase the capability of Shapecast. I'd like to do two-part molds or multi-part molds, non-revolved forms, things like that. However, the blocker there really has been the underlying code complexity, and that's been a challenge I've been struggling with a little bit. In terms of creating value, things that people are willing to spend their money on because it's important to them, that's one of the reasons I jumped into handles. For a lot of people, selling mugs is one of their bread and butter items, and so far Shapecast couldn't really help there too much. So for handles, I actually want to go ahead and create a full-on design platform similar to Shapecast, where you can go ahead and specify basically whatever handle you want within some certain constraints. So when I was developing the infrastructure behind the handles that are for sale now, I did think about this a little bit. However, I realized the front-end web page for that would be relatively complicated. With Shapecast, I'm asking you to draw the SVGs and upload it, and that's actually a challenge for many of you. Handles are even more complicated, and I figured instead of trying to tackle that challenge, let me go ahead and predefine a bunch of different handles for you guys to pick from. That by itself had enough technical constraints. I had to go ahead and figure out all the payment processing and products and all that other stuff, bunch of infrastructure there, and it's been working, which has been great. One of the other things that handles let me do is I was able to test some different 3D software infrastructure, and that worked much better than what I'd been doing before. So I'm actually in the process of rewriting the core of Shapecast using a similar software stack. That will hopefully finally unblock me and let me add those new features of Shapecast that I've been thinking about for quite a while now. As far as the handles and the business side, it's still very early in the monetization, but the handle sales have already outpaced my YouTube income, which isn't much, but it's definitely something. And either way, we all start at zero. So overall on the business side, there's basically work to be done in creating more valuable forms that you guys can sell for more money, or sell more pots that let you get more money, and then me capturing some of that value. That's the overall strategy behind monetizing Shapecast that I have right now. However, when I was doing my research, I realized there's probably a bunch of other products and services that actually fit along with Shapecast. One of the obvious ones is fabrication of the molds themselves, and in particular 3D printing the molds. When I offered the handles for sale, several people reached out and actually wanted me to print the handle molds as well, and I did that. There are a bunch of people that are interested in making their own custom molds, but 3D printing is either too expensive or too complicated or a skill they don't really want to learn, and potentially they can just outsource that to me. Basically, you can either spend your time on something or you can spend your money on something, and if you have a business, spending the money is usually the faster and easier approach to go. So there's a path there for Shapecast and basically offering printed molds. Some people had asked about plaster molds. I'm very reluctant to ship those, they're just so fragile. Printing and shipping the 3D printed parts, I think, may make a lot of sense. And there's a similar constraint on the design side. Several people have expressed how difficult it is to create SVGs. I know this isn't true for everyone, but I think for a lot of people with, say, a traditional ceramics background, drawing digitally and drawing in vector format is not something that they have learned to do, and again, is a big skill to learn. So I think there's also an opportunity here for basically doing custom design services, where someone sends me a sketch of their pot, basically a planned drawing, and then I can do all the digital artwork that then results in the 3D printed models. In turn, that lets you focus on the ceramic parts that you already know and like, yet have this capability of creating new custom forms. Another idea is to go the other direction and to create some courses to teach people how to do these things. Can I create a course that's tailored to Shapecast that lets you draw the SVGs needed, or potentially do the same thing for 3D printing? I wouldn't be able to teach all of 3D printing, but I could teach you just enough that you need to know to be able to print the molds. Or likewise with the skill of drawing the SVGs. However, I'm not too sure how valuable it is. This is really on the critical path for using Shapecast, which I understand, but if we're measuring value in terms of dollars, I'm not too sure how big the dollar amount is here. People want the results, but I'm not too sure that learning these skills is really something that is all that desirable. The other part is putting together those courses would be a fair bit of work. And relative to putting that effort elsewhere into other products or services, it's not clear that it's necessarily a win. So in reflecting on the overall value of Shapecast, it's really in trying to help you increase your ceramics business. There are a lot of hobbyist people out there that are using Shapecast and people that are just trying it out. That's fine. But I think the core value is really for the ones that are running your own business and you want to increase the number of forms you have for sale, or make the production of your forms that much easier so you can spend more time making the pots. However, in reflecting on that as the core value, there's actually several other things I can do to help you increase your sale of pots or selling them for more money. For example, pricing your pots is usually a sticking point. Lots of people have lots of emotions around that, but there's actually some relatively good processes for setting pricing so you can know that you're getting as many pots sold as possible for as much money as possible. Or there are ways to increase the amount of money that you're pulling in without actually selling more pots. Or ways to, for example, get rid of the Etsy fees and control your own destiny so you're not tied to some third-party platform and their whims. Basically, different ways to give you better control over your own income and where you spend your resources. So thinking about this more broadly, if I could show you how to make $50,000 more from your pots, that would probably be worth $10,000 to you. You'd make an extra $40,000, especially if that was a guaranteed outcome. New forms might be one factor in increasing your sales, but there are lots of other things that I've learned being here in Silicon Valley for a long time that could probably be simplified and applied to your own ceramics business as well. And so while I want to keep iterating on the core of Shapecast and its technical capabilities, I think there's a broader set of problems here that can be solved and I can help with in terms of an overall ceramics business and the strategy around that. So that is my current thinking around Shapecast. The origin story of starting it last summer and hacking on some code and then moving into steady state and getting things working while putting my attention elsewhere. And then most recently focusing on the business aspects, both in terms of growing the core capabilities of Shapecast, as well as offering some services so that you guys can actually make more money through your ceramics businesses. If that last part in particular is interesting, do reach out. I'd love to chat more. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks.